This is Progress Canada, presented by Lightbulb Narrative. Today we're joined by Ontario Liberal leadership hopeful Eric Lombardi.
Thanks so much for joining me, Eric.
Thank you so much for having me, Teresa. I'm really happy to be here.
Okay, so we're going to be spending most of our conversation today talking about politics, of course, but, my opinion, and maybe people share this with me, is that it's good to get to know political candidates as people as well. So, without mentioning your political career ambitions or your normal life ambitions, what should the public know about you as a person?
I think the most important trait that I think I bring to this is I have curiosity about how things work. And I think what you'll find in how we talk about anything is I really take this sort of engineer's approach to thinking about the problems we have and how we solve them. I'm still a huge science dork. My educational background is nanotechnology engineering. And so I still really pay attention to what's going on in science and physics. I'm a huge space nerd. Those things are really important to me. I love food. So I love to both cook and I love to eat. And so I think that's a very common thing. My friends and family are very important to me. I love the world and culture and everything that we get to have in this great province. And there's probably another thing people don't know about me, but I have a pretty sharp wit. I don't always bring that out publicly, but maybe people will get a little bit more exposed to that over time. But otherwise, I'm a pretty normal guy.
I was going to say on the wit piece, definitely bring that out because, like Stephen Del Duca, the former leader of the party, one of the funniest people I know in politics. And yet I don't think the public ever really got to see that side of him. And I think that's a shame because he was very, very funny. I want to talk about the nanotech part for a little bit because I think most normal people don't know what the hell that means. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, so nanotechnology engineering is engineering at the nanoscale, which I realize does not help. So the nanoscale is 1/100000th of a meter. So if you think about the width of a length of a piece of hair, which is very hard to see already, that is measured in micrometers. So it's thousands of times smaller than that. And why engineering at this scale is interesting is because physics stops being real. So I'm holding this glass and this glass exists here to being quantum, where everything becomes probability. And because of what that allows us to do, we can make very interesting materials and technologies that make the world better. And I think the thing that most people would be familiar with that really operates on these principles are things like the chips in their phone. And the way that semiconductor engineering works is very much at this scale. And so my educational background really focused on semiconductors, photonics. So those are things like screens, solar panels, etc. And then materials and what you can do with them to make the world more interesting, more advanced, and better.
So you mentioned another thing, which was space. And I'm, just because I was so obsessed with everything Artemis as it was happening, I actually did get a tweet from one of the astronauts as soon as he landed, which was very, very cool. And that will be my favorite name for the rest of my life. What did you think about all that? And also Canada's participation in that?
I love that we were able to participate in the Artemis program with our American friends. I know it doesn't always seem like we're all that friendly with them, but I do think that that is a real milestone for the country. And if you look at the number of countries that have been able to even send someone to do something like that, it's few and far between. I think, especially in Ontario, there's a lot we can have pride in our space sector. And in my own sort of take is these things inspire us. And they inspire the smartest among us to solve problems that end up actually having an impact in the real world. And if you look at the investments that either Canada or even the United States or Europe makes in space, the research and problems that we solved to do these things end up having a 9 times impact on GDP for the investments that we make, which means almost all investments that we're doing in space science end up translating into actually more tax revenue than we put in. And so I think we really miss how important some of these goals are in driving things like research and development spending and new discovery that ultimately finds its way to impact our lives and make our lives better. And so I love everything about it, and I find it very inspiring.
Okay, and then the one other thing from the get to know you section here before I move on is you mentioned cooking. What's your favorite dish to cook? Like I have, during the pandemic, I cooked every day, which is something I'd never done at any other point in my life, but I got really into cooking and coming up with recipes and things like that. What is your go-to that you go to?
I think the one that my friends gravitate to the most is I make like a soft, creamy polenta, and I use a bunch of different sauces and I change it up. And people actually aren't used to having polenta as a meal unless you're from like a pretty Italian background. It's not really something you see at restaurants, etc. And so that's one of the ones I love cooking for people. I also love to do risottos. And I've been experimenting
related
a lot lately as well. And then I love making like a cast iron steak. I know people love to grill, but I think like a really well done cast iron steak, it hits the spot, especially if you have good seasonings and stuff in there. That's always a go-to for me.
Okay, well, now we know what you will do if you ever have a special fundraiser that you're doing, which is a sit-down dinner. We'll have some of those options on the table. I want to talk about your agenda now. So, I've always felt that there are two types of people who run for office. There are people who want to be somebody and people who want to do something. And I actually suspect you're probably in the latter group because you do have a lot of ideas for your campaign already. You got into, civic life because you have pushed for certain ideas, with More Neighbors and other organizations. So I suspect you're in that group. But if you were to become premier, what would be, the 1, 2, 3 things that you really want to achieve by the time you're done?
Yeah. I mean, what I've been saying is my focuses are on the following 3. I want to make our economy competitive. I want to make government work, and I will finally fix housing. But that's a little bit at a vague level. So let me give you a couple more specific things. So on housing, I do think that we have a fundamental challenge in Ontario where we've allowed this problem to create such a bad set of conditions, both for the next generation, and now what we're actually seeing is for our economy as prices correct. And so I think we need to do a couple of things to fix housing. Number one, we've got to fix the rules around permitting and building code, just so that we can make housing built faster and make it more beautiful. Number 2 is we have to address the tax issues on housing. And we're seeing some of that come from the federal government and the province. But we're not doing it for the long term. And more specifically, we're not fixing the relationship between the province, municipalities, and how we actually pay for infrastructure. And I have a lot of ideas about what I want to do there, like giving 1% of HST to cities. I'll be talking about speculation taxes that I'm going to use to pay for this stuff, as well as eliminating development charges and land transfer taxes, which I just think are a tax on growth and really bad and generationally disproportionate impact. Number 3 is we got to deal with people who are going to be caught holding a bag if prices do become sustainable relative to incomes. And our inability for our political leaders to talk about what it means to structure support for people who might get trapped out of equity because they bought, during the peak, I think is irresponsible. Our province allowed this issue to get this bad. And if our goal is to actually return sanity to what a normal income can translate into ownership and rent, then we're going to have to deal with the people who bought into a system that was running away from them in the first place. And our political leaders have been very dishonest about it. And then we need to talk about the non-market component, which I also think should be about 20% of all new housing that we build, and what we can do there to really ensure that these non-market models like co-op housing really do have a great future in the province. Okay, another issue I really care about is not just building things like transportation and energy infrastructure, but our approach to how we build it ends up creating a lot of high costs for the building of infrastructure. So if you look at the Ontario line, it's $1.1 billion per kilometer, even though half of it is above ground on an existing right-of-way for rail. We see places like Paris or Madrid building fully underground and automated transit at about $250 million per kilometer, or about a quarter. And this is not a mystery why. what they do is they have a system for ongoing expansion of their infrastructure. And what politics does is they fund an institution that recurringly invests in the expansion of the infrastructure through a long-term plan where they're using clear standards and effectively manufacturing the next increment. And that's what allows them to bring their costs down. The same is sort of true in how France did its nuclear energy expansion, where they didn't do it as a set of one-off projects, but as a system where they chose one design and did a lot of the pre-permitting for where they want to build it, and then started to basically copy and paste, and really using all of that knowledge and talent over a long term so everyone can reduce their risk and make good investments in how to bring costs down. We in Ontario do not see our governments approaching these things this way. It's still one-off projects, it's mega consortiums, and all of this is proven to be ineffective. So I'm really keen on fixing this problem. And I'd say the third thing when it comes to our economic competitiveness is that a large amount of our private economy has become protected by government policy in a lot of ways. People know we have monopolies and oligopolies and all of these different sectors. And I think it's very hard to understand all of the influences that do that. But our regulatory system very much does result in creating high barriers to entry in our economy. Our permitting systems are quite slow. And so we don't see the kind of investment that would create more competitive services that ultimately result in a bigger premium on top talent, which we're losing a lot of to the US these days, as well as in creating new jobs that allow people to raise their incomes as well. And I think the connection between all these things is poorly understood, but I think it's actually critical for government to address. I realize I'm on a rant now, but we talk about having a minister for red tape reduction, but this government is saying that they're getting rid of one red tape over here, but they're creating a lot of it in all these other places. I think this has become a meme, but the actual hard work of addressing our challenges in our permitting and regulatory systems has barely been touched by any level of government. And if we don't do it, we're going to continue to see that our economy is underperforming its potential.
You touched on a lot there. I want to talk about housing because, of course, 10 years ago, I worked in the government and Ministry of Housing as a comms person, so not as a policy person, of course. But it struck me at the time that we weren't going to get anywhere if prices didn't come down. And the thinking in a lot of corners, and I suspect with More Neighbors Toronto too, because the whole idea is let's build more, let's get more units built, and then that will help bring prices down. My apartment in the immediate block I'm on, there was 9 projects that were approved. Now, with how the market's going, the ones that were underway are definitely happening. The rest of them are probably going to remain gravel pits at this point. We'll see where it goes. But the argument has been made in many corners that, if we build more supply, prices will come down. And that's the only thing we really need to do. I think it's more complicated than that. But the other part of that is what you mentioned, which is if prices come down, there are going to be people who lose in that equation. And I think politicians who are usually within that group as property owners, they have been too afraid to let that happen. So they haven't actually been addressing the housing shortage in any kind of meaningful way, as we've seen by, our backward progress recently. How would you actually address that? Because it sounds like you'd be willing to actually tackle that problem and really get at the heart of it, but that you also recognize you need to help the people who get caught in the middle there. What is the plan for that?
Yeah, for helping people who are caught in the middle, and I'll have more to say this during the campaign. I'm not sure if we're going to call it like down payment mobility insurance, or if we're going to call it like downward mobility prevention. So it's really about creating a program that, especially if you've bought your home and you were insured by the CMHC on the home that you purchased, that when you sell your home and you might have to take an equity loss, that you can still afford to buy your next home, or you can afford to say, I want to start a family, but I can't do it in this condo and I'm like either underwater or I'm not going to recuperate my investment. It's going to be both a grant and loan-based program that allows people to do that move and be able to either realize or feel comfortable with that change, and so that their financial futures aren't undermined. And I think being able to stay, for example, as an owner is psychologically important for a lot of people. I think people who already own homes and they have for a long time, what they care about is other homes are changing in relative value to what they have, because that ultimately translates into their purchasing power too. So that's what we'll do there. And we'll do other things as well. Like a big part of moving and the burden is the cost of moving. So I want to eliminate things like land transfer taxes, which I just think are a barrier to mobility and therefore productivity. So all these things will help people manage the change. And the program that we're going to bring in will probably be temporary for about 10 years in length. And if we look at where current prices are, it's probably about a $500 million a year program. If prices fall 40%, it's closer to a $5 million a year program. But I also think that that's a worthwhile thing to spend money on. And what's the point of actually having debt capacity for is one-time events so that we can give people economic confidence again. And that's really what the goal is going to be. The other side of this is getting the industry moving again. And that means that the price points that become viable for them to move forward on projects have to be lower. I think what people miss when we talk about supply is that the way you increase supply is that you take projects that aren't valuable at an existing price point and you lower the costs that they incur to approach it. And that way they become viable at a lower price point. And that's really how you generate more supply. I think sometimes you think we build more supply and prices come down, but it's actually kind of like costs to build have to come down, and therefore you get more supply at lower prices. So that's a really important thing, I think, for a lot of people to understand. And that is processes, that is building code. I think people don't appreciate how much our building code in Ontario makes what we build uglier and smaller than it ought to be. And we should actually be building far more beautiful and spacious places for people to live at lower costs today. And we actually know most of the changes that we would need to do in order for us to get there. And so that's something that I would be very, very keen on. And the elephant in the room in all of this is how do you address how municipalities finance infrastructure for growth? Because it's become reliant on new housing. And so I will be shifting the tax burden for new housing away from builders and on to speculators, and even giving cities some new tools for those who are doing like upzonings to flip land and raise their land values. If construction doesn't start within a period of time, then the city should be allowed to actually tax that property as if the building that was proposed is occupied. And then I think what you'll end up seeing is a lot of people who are actually applying for building permits are serious about getting them so they can start construction. And so I think a lot of these things are just about fixing the system that we have. And there's a whole other conversation about what more we can be doing on the non-market side as well.
So I think you may be the first person I've heard who doesn't think we have to have a big group of losers in this situation, because I think historically people have thought, well, eventually the population will swing where there's just so many non-owners that the system corrects itself there. And then, that's problematic for people who already own. But I think what you've laid out is a creative solution to make sure there isn't just like millions of losers in the housing sector going forward.
Let's acknowledge that we've created losers by allowing the situation to get as bad as it is. And the long-term loser is Ontario's economy and the actual interest people have in building their lives here, which I think is critically important. And so if we're going to fix the system, and I'll quantify this, the price to income ratio in Ontario is 8-1 right now. An affordable market that's still kind of pricey is 5-1. So we need to get back to that level. So that means we need incomes to grow and we need prices to go down, and we need our economy not to be hurt through this by the reduction in consumer confidence that you would have by people feeling the loss of wealth effect from lower prices. And so let's acknowledge that if we need prices to go lower, we're going to create losers. That is not their fault. And so the government itself needs to take accountability and responsibility for the transition to something better. And I'm willing to say that, and I don't think I've seen any other politician in this country admit it that clearly.
The decisions government makes with the policies it implements does create winners and losers, and we do need to reflect that in how we move forward. So that, we've talked a lot about policy. I'm going to swing over to the party side now because I know a lot of people listening will want to hear about that. Despite the party's losses over the last 3 elections, there's still quite a number of liberals in this province. We haven't disappeared. There are a number of diehard liberal supporters that exist. There are other people who are also willing to look at the party, of course. So I want to focus first on liberal supporters, and then we'll get to those other folks. But, if you were to become leader, how would you engage, support, and I think most importantly, leverage the talents of the people who already support our party? Because I think there is a tendency that volunteers are just seen as somebody to go to the door and they don't have much value beyond that, or to cut a check or something like that. But I think there's a lot of talent in this party still, and I think we could be leveraging it better. How would you go about doing that?
So this is a really good question. So I think there's a couple of things that have gone wrong, right? The weakness in the central party's ability to do fundraising has led it more and increasingly to rely on PLAs and to be quite assertive in trying to kind of take what it can from the people that it has in its audience. So I think, number one, the central party needs to become clear at appealing to more types of industries and organizations and people so that they're willing to invest in that. If you look at how the PLAs actually elect candidates, the candidate fees themselves go to the central party. And I actually think that disincentivizes having really competitive nomination races themselves. So I would actually like to see all candidate fees for each riding for nominating new candidates to actually stay in the riding so that they're incentivized to run competitive processes. Number two is we have a lot of defunct ridings. So I would like to see us create a riding startup fund so that for all the ridings in Ontario where we really don't have enough activity, that we are creating, is it $5,000, $10,000, $15,000 for those who want to restart these parties to have some resources going in. Number three, I think our technology stack as a party leaves a lot wanting. My background's in technology, and so I've used, things like the List and Minivan, and they're great pieces of software 10 years ago, but they really aren't great pieces of software anymore. We have very disjointed systems for even our PLAs to use when it comes to doing email outreach, like design standards for posters and events, even ensuring that they're doing consistent things. Like, are we doing more days of action like we see with the federal party? So we're doing better management of the data that we have. What is our approach to engagement with local civil society orgs? There really isn't much guidance from the central party on how to do all this relationship building stuff that I learned what was really important when I was doing more Neighbors Toronto. And so I think that there's a lot of these tactical things that we need to do better. I think number four, I think our central party has always been a little bit more clever than half in trying to kind of control outcomes that we see, particularly in target ridings. I think we should just not have that inclination anymore and value competitiveness on who is running and giving everyone more bandwidth to do more. I think our party itself needs to see itself as a platform and build technology infrastructure that makes it such. And right now, even with the way that we publish events in the party, we're not really thinking of ourselves as a platform. We actually put a lot of restrictions on what gets published to the party versus what activities happen in PLAs. And I really just do think that seeing the party as infrastructure for all of the ridings is probably the more important model going forward that I would like to see. I think that we're not doing enough engagement on policy. I think we have a lot of commissions and then we kind of ignore the recommendations and results. And almost everyone who engages in politics is ultimately here because there are issues that they really care about and they see them being reflected or have the potential to be reflected in the Ontario Liberal Party. And so I think we don't give people that outlet and we only see them as door knockers or things. we're actually not doing a good job at satiating that feeling that I'm doing this in direction of a purpose and things that I actually believe in. And that was really important in More Neighbors as well. And so I actually do think that, the way we engage people on ideas should not be, oh, we do a policy convention one every 4 AGMs, and maybe or maybe not that will result in making its way to our platform. I think with the way that we have modern social media and modern engagement, we should actually be doing a lot more specific things where we're trying to collect feedback on policies that we want to pursue and see if the many intelligent people in our party have clarifications or things to add. And that way we can actually create great ideas and platforms that go forward. I realize I'm a little bit of a rant here, but I hear all the time that policy doesn't matter in politics. But I actually do think ideas matter a lot. If you even look in the past at very successful campaigns, and I'll give credit for this, like Mike Harris's Common Sense Revolution. That was a thick document. Or even the Red Book under Jean Chrétien was really quite comprehensive. People don't care about all the details, but they care that the parties that we're asking to lead us are thinking about the problems and that they're relatively aligned on the ones that they really care about.
I was going to say that actually brings up a point for me, because I worked with the folks who worked on the Red Book, which was really cool for me because I'm a platform nerd. Despite not being a policy person myself, I always say that, but maybe I'm slightly one. I don't know. But the policy process with someone like you has a lot of really specific ideas and a lot of detailed knowledge about different policy areas. The thing that comes up for me, you just said, people don't necessarily care about the details necessarily, but they care about the ideas, larger ideas. And I think this is something that when we're designing a policy process, it goes two ways. You either have a really detailed process where people are submitting, specific resolutions that have exact wording, and they kind of then assume it's going to go exactly like that in government, and that's never how anything works once you actually start going, of course. But then the other problem with that is the reverse is that you get, okay, well, we want to protect our water, and it's okay, well, that's really, really not detailed at all, and what was the point of that policy process, right? So there's that part. And then the second part here is, whether detailed or not, and creating a process that people feel really engaged with. As somebody who cares about the details, what happens if you create a policy process, the party comes up with something, and it really goes against what as an expert in housing or something like that? What would you do in that situation in terms of developing a platform?
I'm a politician. The role that I play is in trying to help people understand a certain set of ideas that I have, right? And so if the party is not aligned with me on a set of ideas, it doesn't mean I go against the party. It means that I need to persuade people in where I think that we're going right and where we think we're going wrong. And I think politicians, and this has been true as long as I've been alive, have really failed to understand that political capital isn't something that you accumulate and save for the long haul, but that you spend when you have it so you can get results on the things that you care about. And so I think people will find that my attitude towards how we do these things will be a little bit different.
The next thing I want to talk about is swing voters and just people sort of beyond the traditional liberal rump of 20% or so, or whatever it is in the province. When I look back at other governments, in the last year, I've interviewed every living Ontario Liberal premier, and they all had something in common, which was they had growth elections, which, if you're in opposition, the only way to get to government is to have a growth election, of course. That means you have to appeal to voters who voted for somebody else last time in different communities and actually win over enough support. So we saw this with Peterson McGuinty and when they all took over Conservative and NDP seats to win their governments. How would you reach out to voters beyond the Liberal Party to expand our vote pool?
I already think that in many ways, I'm viewed as someone who is not extraordinarily partisan. And I do have a lot of fans and followers who are often more conservative or more NDP, because sometimes the stuff I'm putting forward is more generational too. And so I do find I have even a younger audience that might be a little bit more nonpartisan themselves. I've been writing for the Hub for years. And so there's a lot of conservative voters that, that is more of a center-right publication and who have liked a lot of the things that I have to say. I think one of the ways our party wins is, you take the conservative vote from 40% to 30%. And, you take the NDP vote from 20% to 15%. And suddenly you're in majority territory. And so I think what people will find is the things that I'm putting forward will kind of cut across in different areas that appeal to different voters. Like, I'd say on fiscal issues and state capacity and spending, there's a lot of things I have to say that I think conservatives are quite happy to hear. But then there's other positions I have, like I'm a big proponent of proportional representation, because I believe one of the great challenges in our modern democracy is the legislative gatekeeping that now occurs through the Premier's office and the PMO. And so I think proportional representation, for a lot of other benefits that it could have, can actually address some of these challenges as well. I know there's a lot of NDP voters who also care about an issue like that. And so for me, it's not about saying, oh, how do I angle every specific voter? But I know that there's things that I'm going to put forward that a lot of conservatives might like. And there's going to things I'll put forward that a lot of people who are progressives will also like. And I think if we're putting out these ideas that people trust and they want to see happen, it's not about being liberal. It's about being smart. And I think that there's a lot of voters you can appeal to by having that approach.
Are there any red lines for you in trying to attract those folks that you won't go over? So I'm very much a charter liberal. I think if liberals don't adhere to the charter, there's no point to our party. It's the whole point of our party for the last 40 odd years. Are there any lines that you wouldn't cross? I think we've had some, pretty intense social issues across Canada, mostly spilling over from the US over the last little while. But I think there are probably some lines that I think most liberals would say that's not a liberal position. Is there anything for you?
The way I always think of a problem is like, what are the outcomes? And then what are the incentives in the system? And then how do I get better outcomes? So I think that there are some moral things that we want to stand on. Like, for instance, I don't think Ontarians even desire a conversation about private healthcare when they feel like they're not seeing the system that we have get the proper investment and reform they know could make it better, right? There's a lot of conservatives who want to have that conversation. And it's like, guys, there are so many known problems with what we could fix in our public system that, like, nobody wants to see us go there if we're not willing to do that work either. So I'm not willing to cross that line, is like an example that I would go to. But I would probably say there's probably fewer lines for me than maybe some other liberals, because to me, it's not about feelings matter in politics, but I want to solve problems. And if it means convincing people that there's a solution out there that we might have thought was out of the box but could work, it's up to me to do that work. But I would never abandon what I believe are my liberal principles in pursuit of power ever.
Okay, so I think an important element of leadership is looking back at where we've been and figuring out, what we got right, what we didn't. And we have two options for that really at this point. We can look at our past in government. Most recently, I would say McGuinty and Wynne years. I think Peterson is going a little too far back, since I think you and I were both toddlers around that time. But the McGuinty and Wynne years, what do you think we got right during that period of government, and what do you think we got wrong?
I mean, I think we made a lot of reforms for our public systems that were actually quite good. And then we abandoned, and now we're finding out that we're getting them again. So I'll give you an example of that is like community and family health clinics, which I think are a great model for like full spectrum of care for the individual, and also make it a lot easier for doctors themselves, because there's actually a lot of administrative burden for doctors who are private entities. And these systems make it actually a lot easier for them to focus on their actual job. And then the conservatives came in, they got rid of the model. And then now we're back at actually, we liked how that model was working, and now we're actually going back to it. So I think that there's a lot of stuff there that we did quite well. I will say, I do believe that the Wynne and McGuinty era was a bit, there are luxury beliefs that kind of permeated some of the things that we were doing. And so if you look at like 2003, when we brought forward the growth plan, Outside of downloading in the 1990s, that really screwed up how municipalities are governed and the amalgamations that happened there. The other side of the card there was the growth plan really was predicated on a lot of luxury thinking and did a lot of good things for environmental reasons, but never made all the hard trade-offs on land use, et cetera, in the places that we were built up. And in many ways, the combination of those two things were what got us into our housing mess in the first place. And I really don't think liberals have really reconciled with our mistakes there. And I'll also say, like, our electricity system, we did reforms late in the Winn-McGuinty era because people were really mad about energy prices, and it really kicked the can down the road. And we've seen the Conservatives actually take the messy subsidies that we started implementing there and just blow it out. And now our energy sector subsidies are $7 billion a year. So we really started something that created what I think is becoming an increasing problem. And now that we have this model in place, there's a huge political risk. Like, there's $4 billion that goes to subsidizing commercial electricity now in Ontario. And what happens if you got an NDP government that's saying, why are we subsidizing all these big businesses? Well, now commercial prices could dramatically change. And so if you're someone who's looking to invest in the province, and where electricity should really be a huge advantage for us, because of the system that we created to solve that short-term political challenge, the Conservatives have not made it better either. But now we actually have a major problem that we need to fix, and I really don't think is on enough people's radar. So there's a lot of good things that we did. There's some luxury thinking and short-term things that we did as well that I think we're still paying for today.
I think you were hinting around it there, but I'm going to just draw it out. When you're talking about the growth plan, would you consider opening up the Greenbelt then? Because it sounds like that's sort of what you're talking about. And I will say, when McGuinty and Wynne were there, they did do land swaps as well. This isn't an exclusively Ford era thing. He has wanted to do more of them, and for maybe less scrupulous reasons. But is that something you would touch? Do you think we need to actually open up that protected land to get housing where it needs to be?
I want a rule-based system for considering how we change or modify the Greenbelt, but I'll actually say that the Greenbelt should be expanded more as well. And we also see that there's a lot of like connected moraines. You could even call it the Blue Belt, because especially once we get into central Ontario, there's actually a lot of land that we require to protect in areas like Guelph and Waterloo and Brantford that have groundwater-based systems that we actually didn't go far enough to address as well. But then, I look at, if you go up Highway 404 here, or the DVP, you can get to like Bloomingfield or Bloomingdale Station, Bloomfield. It's near Aurora, but it's a GO station, and it's surrounded by the Greenbelt. But actually, a lot of it is estate housing and golf courses. And I can't go there and say, well, this was a perfect thing. I also do think that we're likely to go and pursue things like Highway 413, right? We have east-west travel challenges in the GTHA. So if we are going to build that highway, we probably need to consider how we're building, commercial, industrial, and residential land around that infrastructure that we're building so that we get good value out of it. And so I think sometimes we box ourselves in far too much. But to me, the overall goal is to protect farmland and agricultural land and biodiversity land that truly meets that criteria. And if we're going to do land swaps, have real rule-based criteria around it. If you look at what Ford did with the Greenbelt thing, it was like a couple of developers that were close to them lobbied the government and got this disproportionate value uplift by being connected to government. That's a discretionary system, and that really does open up things to corruption. But, one more thing to add on to this. We have a whole bunch of greenfield and brownfield land within the Greenbelt that isn't being developed, both because municipalities have been too slow to service it, but also we do not have good incentives for the redevelopment of land. And so you'll see that I'll be bringing forward what I call a land speculation tax, which will tax underutilized land 1% every year, because the property tax, there might not be a lot built on it. The property doesn't have a ton of value, but the value it could be based on its land that could provide for housing is a lot more. And that will actually re-incentivize the development of these places, because we create a cost to holding underutilized land that we should be using in the first place.
You brought up a few interesting examples there, because of course, pre-recording, we were talking about how I got sunburnt yesterday, and it was along the Humber River, and you can walk basically the Humber River all the way up to the lakes on the other side of Ontario, functionally, if you want to go far enough. But you also brought up the golf courses in Aurora, and I grew up in Newmarket, and there was a big battle about Newmarket's golf course, and the people who backed onto it loved it as green space because they had nothing in their backyards. But of course, is that really the green space that we're looking for, and is that protected farmland? Of course not. So there are a lot of conversations that be had with this, but I very much take your point that when you don't have very clear rules, it is something that gets opened up to corruption, and I think that's one of the things we have to address. The second part of this is, we talked about government, but we've also been in opposition now for 8 years. And, political wilderness is not the most fun, but there are things that you can do when you were in opposition. What's one thing that the party has really gotten right in opposition, and what have we gotten wrong in this time in the wilderness we've had?
I mean, I think what we actually see the party doing right now is actually really starting to work. And I do think that we've become better at being aligned as a party on the message. And I think post-win, we really didn't have that kind of tightness. We've also seen new voices come in. Like, one of the MPPs I really like is Tyler Watt, and I think he's doing an amazing job on engaging people on socials and things like that. And we do see a lot more of that occurring. And so I don't know if that's just been self-interest, but I actually think the party is doing much better there. I think our biggest challenge as liberals as well is opposition doesn't necessarily mean oppose all the time. And I think we've gotten ourselves into a state where we've been so risk adverse that Doug Ford proposes a thing, and how dare Doug Ford propose that thing? We're mad. We're not doing as good of a job at being the proposition. Like, what is the opportunity cost, right? Like, we can talk about being mad at spending $1 billion on the Ontario Science Centre. But one of the videos that I did was like, what could $1 billion in cultural investment mean in cities and towns around the province? Like, can we allow Windsor to rehabilitate its waterfront, right? Can we allow Thunder Bay to build out and do the work to expand its Site 6 area, right? Do we allow the Byward Market revitalization to go forward in Ottawa? Do we help fund the Shaw Festival revitalization in Niagara Falls? Do we help Hamilton with its waterfront for $100 million, right? And so I do think that we sometimes have a hard time proposing new things. And I think liberals have long looked to personality politics to be its savior. And it worked for the federal government with Mark Carney coming in. And I do think there's a little bit of a hope with Bonnie Crombie that that's sort of what would be it. And we've instead forgotten that we need to present a reason why. And I think we've lacked our ability to find what we represent, what our why is, and what we actually think the real problems in Ontario are. And so what I think I'm offering that will be unique in this is that I have a very clear why for why I'm running, and that I'm going to put forward an agenda that some people might disagree with, but it'll allow people to think about the future and the direction we should be going on a variety of issues. And I don't think our leaders have always been so strong at understanding their own vision and their own why and articulating that to people. I think the consequence of not doing that properly is that we've lacked an authenticity that we need to regain people's trust.
Something you brought up there that I think is really interesting is this idea of okay, the Ontario Science Centre, Ontario Place, everything that's happening on the Toronto waterfront, because Doug is very obsessed with the Toronto waterfront and little else. Everything he's focusing on there, you pivoted that to, well, what about Windsor? What about the Byward Market? What about all these things? And it reminded me of during the Peterson years, they actually had like a downtown like waterfront revitalization program, which was responsible for North Bay's beautiful waterfront, for example. And I think there is a real opportunity for coming up with those kinds of ideas. And when he is so focused on downtown Toronto, not even downtown Toronto, waterfront Toronto, when he's so
Yeah.
focused on that, there's an opportunity for Liberals to say, well, what about this place over here? Because I think you can't just say Doug only cares about this. You have to show that you care about the other places as well, and that you know about them, and that you have a relationship to those communities. Which actually brings me to my next question, which is about how do we rebuild the party regionally? So for a long time, even in government, people would write off Southwest, they would write off parts of the North, they would write off parts of Eastern on write off all these areas until you're writing off so much that you're no longer winning elections anymore. And I think we have to get back to a growth mindset, get back to, trying to win every different community and seeing where that ends up. The Win Liberals, they won seats that we hadn't won in over 100 years, and it's because they put in that work, regardless of what the electoral history had been. What do you think we need to do to actually rebuild everywhere across the province?
Well, we need to be everywhere, anywhere, and all at once, constantly, right? One of the things that I think our last two leaders got wrong is that they tried to manage a tighter message and not realizing that, number one, embracing productive controversy is actually how you get in front of people and define what you stand for.
Before you even go on that, I want to tell a story about the 2022 campaign, because I remember Doug, once again, was focused on downtown Toronto at the time. And I said, we need to come up with I was working on lit at the time. I said, we need some lit. We designed some lit that was basically like, Doug only cares about the GTA. Like, what about you in Northern Ontario? I don't remember what it actually said. That's not what was on it. But it was that kind of concept of like, what about the rest of the province? And I was told in no uncertain terms that Stephen will never go for that. We can't have a message that says like Doug only cares about this because Stephen also cares about this area. I'm like, well, that's not the same thing being said, right? And they didn't want to engage with that controversy. And to your point, that's why we didn't, win on that issue when it's just sitting there for us to take. Anyway, continue.
I actually remember, because I was doing all this housing stuff, especially in like 2022, 2023, and I could really start to see the blowback on temporary foreign workers and international students happening. And I remember talking to the party, it's like Doug Ford created a Ponzi scheme out of our higher education system. And somehow the federal government is wearing the bag for all of these mistakes that were provincial doing. Like, why are we pinning the tail on the donkey here? And, the response from some of the people are, well, we're scared of how like ethnic communities are going to respond to this. And I'm like, do you know anyone who is like from India and has been in Canada for 15 years? Like, they are pissed. They go to a restaurant and it's like, oh, are you Uber Eats? Like, they are mad about this too. And there is this fear that if we actually talk to the anger here, that we would piss off some of our constituencies. And I'm like, our constituencies of citizens are just as mad across the board. And so I really do think that we've had a hard time just like being in touch with where people are in this respect. But I also think, going back to what I was going to go for before this is, our next leader has to be on radio every day. They've got to be on TV anytime they've got an opportunity. They need to be writing op-eds, like in local papers, national papers, Ontario papers. You got to be on social media. Like, we can't expect people to come to us. I still think that there's this old school thinking in the party that, oh, well, you know what, we'll have an idea and we'll do a grand announcement and everyone's going to report on it and everyone's going to read it. And there's a grand unveiling that is going to occur. And that is just not the modern information economy. Like, you got to get in people's eyeballs in every small little way. And it's got to be drip, drip, drip. They just constantly see us. And we're there by accident. We're there when they don't want them to be. We're there all the time. And to me, that's how we end up getting people like, oh, wow, they're really active. Like, oh, they're putting out really good things. Or like, that was kind of a neat idea. So I really do think like our disposition to risk-taking and how we get in front of people just needs to be dramatically different than what we've been doing in the past.
So that actually brings up, I think about like when Stephen Del Duca was leader, he did op-eds constantly. He was always in Toronto Sun, for example. Like he was everywhere. They did so much media, and I was actually really impressed with how much media they did. However, I was somebody paying deep attention to what was going on, so I saw that media. And then I look at somebody like Mark Carney now with his forward guidance videos and recognizing that, you know what, people are online. YouTube's like the second most used website after Google search itself. So, you know,
Yeah.
that's where people are. And even just the reaction to that video, of course, you had people on Twitter being like, well, what is this? This isn't that interesting, whatever. And then you had, you know, more tech bro types on YouTube who had never heard from the prime minister in any way, seeing this for the first time and going, oh, this is really interesting. This is good messaging, etc. So that actually brings me to my next question, which is, you know, retooling campaign mechanics. So I don't think we are ever going to have a world where canvassing doesn't matter. And I think we need to be moving towards deep canvassing where we're actually spending time with voters instead of just counting heads.
Yeah.
Putting that aside, there is also the fact that I also believe that we are now in a world where we are digital first campaigns. Our first contact and our last contact with voters will likely be online, and we need to act that way. We need to plan that way. And, you know, rather than say maybe focusing on so many TV ads, we're focusing on digital ads because, you know, even this podcast, the number one place that people watch it is on YouTube on their televisions, which is not what I expected when we started. But given all of that, where do we need to get back to basics and, you know, rebuild our muscles on those core areas where we've had some atrophy, and where do we need to launch into this decade in terms of where we've really fallen behind in tech? Because I think there are a number of places where that's the case.
I mean, I broadly agree with you. And I think it's just a yes and strategy. It's got to be a willingness to just do more, be in more places and in as many formats as we can. I think we should, look, I think message control and tightness, it matters. But it doesn't matter so much that if you're not doing more stuff, then you're not getting in front of people. And so we really need to just give all of our MPPs confidence, like, you know, you should be putting out 3 videos to social media every week, talking about something that you care about. It doesn't even have to be aligned with a party's core message, but just give people constant reasons to engage and get to know you and what you think. You've got to do a variety of well-produced to scrappy digital from the center of the party. You know, I'll even give, you know, a lot of people don't like Pierre Poilievre in this party, but like I'll give him some credit in the videos that he was doing in the lead up to last election on some of the issues. I thought they were very well produced and they spoke to his audience quite well. And I didn't see us doing any of that kind of thing to explain our thinking and in our ideas. And while you don't get massive audiences all the time for these things, when you do stuff like that, you go deeper with the people that do view it. And so sometimes I think we optimize for trying to do what we think is the right thing versus doing as many things as we can because we need to experiment and learn more. I don't know if that answered your question.
You know, in doing this podcast, because again, when I was at the party office, like I started our digital fundraising program, I was the one who's like, Facebook timelines didn't exist when I was doing social media for the party. Like I got to launch our timeline, like an insane thing in my history. So, you know, like it has changed dramatically since that time. And I am not still in those kinds of roles. So I haven't kept up as much with it. But then doing this podcast, I've seen so much of like what goes on now and what you have to be doing. And my God, the amount of time I spend working on clips is stupid. But, you know, there's all these things. And what I've learned, though, is that like you need to give things time to breathe and not cannibalize. So you do have to be strategic about when you release. But at the end of the day, people are going to engage with it when they do. It may not flare up when you first release it. It may not flare up, you know, related to the topic you even thought it was going to flare up. But you need to have that content there so people can engage with it on their terms, on their time. It's really that like on-demand communication. You need to have pile of stuff out there that people can just go access when they have time, because again, like people are busy, they have their own agendas, like they have other things going on. They're not going to be sitting there waiting for you to release a news release, whatever announcement you're doing. Like that's just not the reality anymore. So I think your idea of having as much content as possible available that is, you know, on message, on brand, all that kind of stuff, connected to other things. Like even with this episode, when it comes out, we will release clips that, you know, on YouTube, you can say, add to other video, and As soon as you finish playing a clip from this video, it will go to the main video. Like, there's all these connection points that we need to be doing, and you can only do that if you've got a pile of content to go with.
Yeah, and I think we still haven't exited the 2000s and 2010s communication mindset. Like, I'm gonna get criticized the party here. Like, when I get emails from the party itself, it's either give us money or extraordinarily partisan viewpoint of something that happened. And what I love more is and I actually have a huge gripe with this, and I don't mean to criticize my competitors in this race, but I go to events with them sometimes. We do Q&As, and I find we say a lot of words to not say anything at all. And I'm like, can you guys just answer the question? Or say something real, right? And I think that's what people want to engage with more. So if we were even sending stuff out that's here's an issue that we care about, and here's how we think we address it. And we're not trying to tune up the partisanship to 100, but we're actually just talking about a problem and what our options are. I think all of a sudden it's yes, this is why I'm interested in politics. This is adding value to me because it's helping me learn something or change my mindset or actually take a position on something that I care about. And I think we become so controlled that it's uncanny.
Yeah. I was gonna say, I think you're right, because even with this podcast, we do panel episodes, right? And part of our requirement for panelists, there's a few requirements. They have to be progressive. They have to be able to talk, and their job won't get mad about it. That's a key one.
Yeah.
But they can't, and they have to know politics, but then they can't be just providing canned talking points. Because if you go on, if you go watch a TV panel, that's what it is. It's parties putting up people they know will go recycle their talking points. And that might be interesting to some people. I don't find that interesting as somebody who's been in politics. And I want, you can still have a good key message, but it shouldn't feel like it's this inauthentic, rehearsed thing that you don't even believe yourself when you're saying it. You're just popping up as much partisanship as you can. I hate that.
I do too. I mean, one of the things, not praising Donald Trump here, but one thing that Trump should kind of give to most politicians is you know what, you should actually feel pretty confident in just being yourself and sharing things that you actually think. Because I actually don't think most voters are looking for someone they agree with all the time, but someone who they think they can understand and whose values they know ultimately that they share. And then they want thinking about problems, because we as voters don't have time to understand every issue in depth. And I really do think that, the risk aversion that I think we have as a party kind of stems from we were in government for 15 years and then we lost. And we had this really, feeling that as we were losing, we need to be really tight about our message control so we don't get in trouble. And we have a lot of people also from the Justin Trudeau government who are coming in now too. And that end of that era was very similar way. And it's guys, we're third place party. We got to take risks. We got to plant the flag in the road. We've got to embrace more controversy so that people see us and they see that we're standing for things. And I think ultimately that matters so much more than what people value it to be.
So speaking of attention grabbing people, Doug Ford is, a master of the attention economy. He's always grabbing headlines, much more so now that his campaign manager is busy in BC for a little while. But he's constantly grabbing headlines. What would you do to compete with that and make sure that we're sort of, we mentioned this earlier, leading the agenda and actually putting things out and leading the discussions that Ontarians are paying attention to?
Well, you answered the question, is having an agenda, putting it forward, and actually forcing the opposition to comment on the ideas, right? As long as we let Doug Ford hold the football of all the ideas that come into fruition in Ontario politics, well, then we're always answering to that. And the media is always asking us to answer to that. Doug Ford has dumb ideas. Why are we putting him in control of them? So we need to be much more assertive in the types of things that we put forward. And we need to get Ford to answer to that. We need to get Merritt Stiles to answer to that as well. And we've got to be the ideas party. And I think the more we do that, the more the media is coming to us, the more the opposition needs to answer to us. And then that makes us look like we're the government in waiting. So we've just got to do exactly what you said.
My one last question is, related to the leadership election itself. So we know it's going to end in November, and it is a very long race. But to become leader, you do have to win that election, and to become premier, you have to win that election. So what's your elevator pitch to voters this November?
If you want a departure from the past, if you want something new, you want ideas forward, you want generational change, you're tired of seeing Ontario squander our potential, you're tired of partisanship forward, but you want ideas first, I'm going to be offering something very different from everyone else in this race. And I think my background, both as an engineer, in financial services, in the private sector, and in advocacy, offers something very unique in this race. And I think you should pay attention to what I can deliver.
Okay, and before we go, where can people find out more about you as a candidate?
You should go to ericforolp.ca, or you can follow me on X and Instagram and TikTok at either Eric B. Lombardi or Eric Lombardi as well. And sign up to my newsletter, because I love to talk to people and talk about how our campaign is going.
Thanks so much for joining me today. This is a great conversation.
Yeah, Teresa, it's a pleasure as always to speak with you. You're such a sharp mind, so very happy to be here.
Points for flattery. There we go.
You've been listening to Progress Canada, presented by Lightbulb Narrative, a Canadian-owned company specializing in strategic communications, narrative development, and content creation. Our music today was composed by Elliot Middleton. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider subscribing to access future episodes the moment they drop. Thanks for listening.